As the Battle of Stalingrad slowly ground to its conclusion, the Red Army moved to a general offensive in the south, in Operation Little Saturn. By January 1943, a 160 to 300 kilometer wide gap had opened between German Army Group B and Army Group Don, and the advancing Soviet armies threatened to cut off all German forces south of the Don River, including Army Group A operating in the Caucasus. Army Group Center came under significant pressure as well. Kursk was retaken by the Soviets on February 8, 1943, and Rostov on February 14. The Soviet Bryansk, Western, and newly created Central Fronts prepared for an offensive which envisioned the encirclement of Army Group Center between Bryansk and Smolensk. By February 1943, the southern sector of the German front was in strategic crisis. Since December 1942, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had been strongly requesting unrestricted operational freedom to allow him to use his forces in a fluid manner. On February 6, 1943, Manstein met with Hitler at his headquarters in Gorlitz, now Girlas, Poland, to discuss the proposals he had previously sent. He received an approval from Hitler for a counteroffensive against the Soviet forces advancing in the Donbass region. On February 12, 1943, the remaining German forces were reorganized. To the south, Army Group Don was renamed Army Group South and placed under Manstein's command. Directly to the north, Army Group B was dissolved, with its forces and areas of responsibility divided between Army Group South and Army Group Center. Manstein inherited responsibility for the massive breach in the German lines. On February 18, Hitler arrived at Army Group South headquarters at Zaporizhia just hours before the Soviets liberated Kharkov, and had to be hastily evacuated on the 19th. Once given freedom of action, Manstein intended to utilize his forces to make a series of counterstrokes into the flanks of the Soviet armored formations. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had arrived from France in January 1943, refitted and up to near full strength. Armored units from the 1st Panzer Army of Army Group A had pulled out of the Caucasus and further strengthened Manstein's forces. Exhaustion of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, coupled with the loss of mobility due to the onset of the spring Rasputitsa, resulted in the cessation of operations for both sides by mid-March. The counteroffensive left a Soviet salient extending 250 kilometers from north to south and 160 kilometers from east to west into the German area of control, centered on the city of Kursk. The heavy losses sustained by Germany since the opening of Operation Barbarossa had resulted in a shortage in infantry and artillery. Units were in total 470,000 men under strength. For the Wehrmacht to undertake an offensive in 1943, the burden of the offensive, in both attacking the Soviet defenses and holding ground on the flanks of the advance, would have to be carried primarily by the panzer divisions. On March 10, Manstein presented a plan whereby the German forces would pinch off the Kursk salient with a rapid offensive commencing as soon as the spring Rasputitsa had subsided. On March 13, Hitler signed Operational Order No. 5, which authorized several offensives, including one against the Kursk salient. As the last Soviet resistance in Kharkov petered out, Manstein attempted to persuade Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, to immediately attack the Central Front, which was defending the northern face of the salient. Kluge refused, believing that his forces were too weak to launch such an attack. Further Axis advances were blocked by Soviet forces that had been shifted down from the Central Front to the area north of Belgorod. By mid-April, amid poor weather and with the German forces exhausted and in need of refitting, the offensives of Operational Order No. 5 were postponed. On April 15, Hitler issued Operational Order No. 6, which called for the Kursk offensive operation, codenamed Citadel, to begin on May 3 or shortly thereafter. The directive was drafted by Kurt Zeitzler, the OKH Chief of Staff. For the offensive to succeed, it was deemed essential to attack before the Soviets had a chance to prepare extensive defenses or to launch an offensive of their own. Operation Citadel called for a double envelopment, directed at Kursk, to surround the Soviet defenders of 5 armies and seal off the salient. Army Group Center would provide General Walter Model's 9th Army to form the northern pincer. It would cut through the northern face of the salient. Driving south to the hills east of Kursk, securing the rail line from Soviet attack. Army Group South would commit the 4th Panzer Army, under Hermann Hoth, and Army Detachment Kempf, under Werner Kempf, to pierce the southern face of the salient. This force would drive north to meet the 9th Army east of Kursk. Manstein's main attack was to be delivered by Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 2 SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser. The 48th Panzer Corps, commanded by Otto von Nobelsdorf, would advance on the left while Army Detachment Kempf would advance on the right. The 2nd Army, under the command of Walter Weiss, would contain the western portion of the salient. The Red Army constructing very strong positions at the shoulders of the salient and having withdrawn their mobile forces from the area west of Kursk.
Anti-tank trenches were dug and thousands of camouflaged anti-tank guns were moved into position. A force of 3,100 planes, 3,600 tanks, and 1.3 million Russian soldiers was in place to blunt the attack by an expected 900,000 German troops outfitted into 50 divisions, 17 of which were armored. The battle commenced with preliminary attacks on July 4th, as General Walter Model's 4th Panzer Division attempted to take Soviet outposts in the south. The Luftwaffe bombed Soviet front positions in the north. By evening, both sides attempted to weaken each other by concerted artillery bombardment. The major clash came on July 5th, as the Russian Air Force attempted to obliterate Luftwaffe bases. Following the air battle, Army Group North launched a major frontal attack. In spite of the incredible depth of Russian defenses, Army Group North was able to penetrate nearly 6 miles into Russian defenses during the opening days of the battle. The penetration, though, resulted in the German tanks being open to close-range anti-tank fire from their more lightly armored sides. The commander of Russian Central Forces, General Konstantin Rokossovsky, responded by sending into the breach anti-tank and artillery brigades supported by 350 fighter planes. By July 7th, the northern attack ground to a halt as the Germans lost 25,000 soldiers and 200 tanks. Southern German forces under General Hermann Hoth, which consisted of 600 tanks and 300,000 soldiers, pressed on the attack by swinging south of Russia's defense line. The southern forces wound up 50 miles southeast of Kursk, near the small village of Prokhorovka. Their movements, however, were closely followed by the Russians. On July 12th, the largest tank battle in human history took place at Prokhorovka, as 1,500 tanks maneuvered to destroy each other at relatively close range in the middle of blinding dust. The situation nullified the advantage new German tanks had in armament and firepower over the Soviet T-34 tank, the staple of the Russian army, which had not undergone significant improvement since the start of the war. Instead of an organized conflict, the Battle of Kursk was a series of encounters in which necessity dictated tactics. German technical advantages were more than offset by Russian numerical advantages. By the end of the day on July 12, German forces had lost 350 tanks and 10,000 soldiers. German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser reviewed the German archive record, calculated that during Citadel 54,182 casualties were suffered. Of these, 9,036 were killed, 1,960 were reported missing, and 43,159 were wounded. 252 to 323 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. Russian historian Boris Sokolov places the losses of the Soviet army much higher, giving the figures of 450,000 killed, 50,000 missing, and 1.2 million wounded throughout the course of the battle. Soviet equipment losses during the German offensive came to 1,614 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed or damaged of the 3,925 vehicles committed to the battle. Soviet losses were roughly 3 times those of the Germans. On the evening of July 12, Hitler summoned Kluge and Manstein to his headquarters in East Prussia. The Western Allies had invaded Sicily. The threat of further Allied landings in Italy or along southern France made Hitler believe it was essential to stop the offensive and move forces from Kursk to Italy. Kluge welcomed the news, as he was aware that the Soviets were initiating a massive counteroffensive against his sector, but Manstein was less welcoming. Manstein's forces had just spent a week fighting through a maze of defensive works, and he believed they were on the verge of breaking through to more open terrain. Which would allow him to engage and destroy the Soviet armored reserves in a mobile battle. Manstein stated, "On no account should we let go of the enemy until the mobile reserves he has committed are completely beaten." Hitler agreed temporarily to allow the continuation of the offensive in the southern part of the salient, but the following day he ordered Manstein's reserve, the 24th Panzer Corps, to move south. The offensive continued in the southern part with the launch of Operation Roland on July 14th. The orders for Operation Roland were issued in the closing hours of July 13th, 1943. However, after Hitler's meeting with Manstein, Hitler countermanded the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler deployment to the Kursk salient, sending it on July 14th to Italy. The assault began at 4 o'clock on July 14th. Following a brief artillery barrage, 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment der Führer of Das Reich struck out for the high ground southwest of Pravera. Evicting the remnants of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps from the village of Bellonicino following violent house-to-house and hand-to-hand fighting. Das Reich's 2nd SS Panzer Regiment fought off a series of counterattacks and forced the Red Army units to withdraw eastward to a new line. Zhukov ordered the 10th Guards Mechanized Brigade of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps to reinforce the line. The 7th Panzer Division of the 3rd Panzer Corps made contact with Das Reich, but Trufanov, commanding the Soviet forces in the gap, was aware of the threat and conducted a fighting withdrawal. The link-up failed to trap the Soviet forces. Though they abandoned a substantial number of their anti-tank guns. Operation Roland failed to produce a decisive result for the German side, and Totenkopf began withdrawing from its positions north of the Selle, following orders issued late on July 15, as the 2nd SS Panzer Corps assumed a defensive stance along its entire front. On July 17, the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts launched a major offensive across the Meuse and Donets rivers against the southern wing of Army Group South, pressing upon the 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army. In the early afternoon of July 17, Operation Roland was terminated with an order for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to begin withdrawing from the Prokhorovka sector back to Belgorod. The German forces of the 3rd Panzer Corps and the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Division Das Reich of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps attempted to envelop and destroy Soviet forces of the Voronezh front. German commanders decided to first link up the 3rd Panzer Corps, which had been lagging behind due to heavy Soviet resistance. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, in order to consolidate the German positions into a continuous front line without inward bulges and enable the 2 Panzer Corps to overrun Soviet forces defending Prokhorovka together. The linking up of the 2 German pincers was planned to effectuate the envelopment of the Soviet 69th Army and other supporting units. By the end of July 15, the 2 German pincers had linked up. But they failed to trap the majority of the Soviet forces. Das Reich and Totenkopf were dispatched south to meet the new Soviet offensives. During Operation Citadel, the Luftwaffe flew 27,221 sorties in support with 193 combat losses. Soviet units from 5 to July 8 conducted 11,235 sorties with combat losses of 556 aircraft. Germans were destroying Soviet aircraft at a ratio of 1 minute and 2.88 seconds. Despite German unit performance, the Wehrmacht was now lacking strategic reserves. In late 1943, just 25% of Luftwaffe day fighters were on the Eastern Front, due to British and US air attacks on Italy and Germany. The Red Army soon went on to the offensive. In his post-war memoirs Lost Victories, Manstein was highly critical of Hitler's decision to call off the operation at the height of the tactical battle. For the first time, a major German offensive had been stopped before achieving a breakthrough. The maximum depth of the German advance was 8 to 12 kilometers in the north and 35 kilometers in the south. The Germans, despite using more technologically advanced armor than in previous years, were unable to break through the deep Soviet defenses and were caught off guard by the significant operational reserves of the Red Army. This result changed the pattern of operations on the Eastern Front, with the Soviet Union gaining the operational initiative. The Soviet victory was costly, with the Red Army losing considerably more men and material than the German army. The Soviet Union's larger industrial potential and pool of manpower allowed them to absorb and replace its losses. The initiative firmly passed to the Red Army. For the remainder of the war, the Germans were limited to reacting to Soviet advances, and were never able to regain the initiative or launch a major offensive on the Eastern